Where do you even start when it comes to Starbucks? I guess they're big, right? That's what I'd like to talk about. They have almost 30,000 locations. What other coffee chain even comes close to that? Tim Hortons, Dunkin' Donuts? Not even when you combine them. On a global scale, and in the US, Starbucks is just by far number one. About half of their locations are in the US, and the other half are spread throughout the rest of the world. Notably, almost 5,000 in China, 1,500 in Canada, 1,200 in Japan, 1,200 in Korea, 1,000 in the UK. About half of those are company owned, and the other half are licensed. Obviously, they make way more money from the company owned stores. Their 2018 revenue, by the way, was almost $25 billion, making them a Fortune 500 company, ranking them right there at 121. I remember, and I don't even think this is as much the case anymore, but everyone used to joke about that. The one I think of was in the second Austin Powers movie. They poked fun at it.
Dr. Evil, several years ago we invested in a small Seattle-based coffee company.
It was a big late night joke, the joke being that there was one on every corner. I guess the joke today being how they always mess up your name when they write it on the cup or call it out. I don't know, but for a company that's well known throughout the world and actually has a subset of jokes about how they're so big, I think it's worth it to take a look at how they got so big. There's two distinct parts to this, concerning different people in different stages of the company. For the first part, we have Gordon Boker, Jerry Baldwin, and Zev Siegel, three students that met each other in the early 1960s while attending the University of San Francisco. The way they all met is actually really unusual. Two of them decided to live together after having only known each other for a few minutes, and then another two met each other through answering a bulletin about carpooling across the country. You can look more into that one, because today I'm staying focused on Starbucks. Well, a few years after graduation, they were all living in Seattle on separate career paths, but looking for a way that they could get together and start working on something. Boker was a writer for a magazine that had just gone out of business, Baldwin was an English teacher, Siegel was a history teacher, but they were all passionate about their coffee. And I'm gonna say particularly Gordon Boker. I say that because he had been taking trips to Vancouver from Seattle, which is a sizable trip, for the sole purpose of bringing back some coffee that he felt was much better than anything he can buy in Seattle. And let's face it, it probably was. That coffee that he would bring back became really popular among his friends. They would buy it from him, and that's where the whole idea came from. The three of them just stopped and said, look, we all love premium coffee, there's an underserved market for it out here, and we're in search for a project. I think it became a no-brainer at that point when they decided that they would open a high-quality coffee store. But they didn't jump right into it. They located a coffee store in California that was successfully doing what they were looking to do. The man who ran that store, Alfred Pete, ended up becoming somewhat of a mentor, and if you're familiar with Pete's Coffee, it's the same Pete. More on that later. So, after about 3 or 4 months of learning about the business and Pete's methods, they each contributed $1,350 of their own money, collectively took out a $5,000 loan, and used it to open up the first ever Starbucks. They settled on that name because they wanted something that started with that strong ST sound. After going through a long list of the ST words, they thought of the first mate from the book Moby Dick named Starbuck. Now there's a name with some strong sounding letters all the way through. Plus, as an added bonus, it evoked the romance of the high seas and the seafaring tradition of the early coffee traders. Though I suspect that may have been more of an afterthought. So here we are. Starbucks now exists as a single Seattle location, but it's important to point out that this store was nothing like the one we know today, mostly because the coffee they sold wasn't ready to drink. Instead, they sold all the stuff so you can make it yourself at home, meaning they sold the coffee beans, teas, spices, in addition to the coffee makers and other accessories. This was more of a retail store than a restaurant, but it did well, and over the next few years, they expanded into a handful of locations around the Seattle area, in addition to starting a wholesale business that would provide their specialty roasted coffee to local restaurants. Zev Siegel, one of the three founding members, left the company in 1980, and that leads us to the second part. This one concerning a man named Howard Schultz. His initial connection with the company was that he was a salesman for one of their suppliers. Something I've noticed about this guy, he recognizes something good when he sees it. I say this because during his first trip to one of those Starbucks stores in 1982, he was so impressed with everything that he instantly wanted in on it, so desperately that he actually convinced them to hire him on as a manager. 1 year later, they sent him to a trade show in Italy. He was in Milan, and again, recognized something good. This time, he was impressed by all the coffee shops and espresso bars that he encountered over there. Just nice, fun, relaxing environments. When he returned, he told Boker and Baldwin about them and heavily urged them to move their business in that direction. He may have come on a little strong, but in his mind, coffee shops and espresso were the way of the future, far more lucrative than the retail business that they were currently pursuing. Boker and Baldwin weren't nearly as convinced. To give them credit, they did listen and start experimenting a bit with the idea, but it was just one location and it wasn't their focus. To Schultz, it wasn't nearly enough, and he wasn't about to pass up this opportunity. So in 1986, he resigned from Starbucks so he could start his own chain of coffee shops that were actually closely tied to Starbucks. They were early investors and actually supplied his coffee. Now, I need to backtrack a little bit because we're talking about too many coffee businesses at one time. Let's take it slow. Remember their mentor, Alfred Pete, and his original coffee business in California that they modeled the first Starbucks after? Well, Pete had since sold it to someone else, and in 1984, Starbucks jumped at the opportunity to buy it, given their history with it and their respect for it. So now they owned it. Then in 1987, Gordon Boker left the company, and Jerry Baldwin decided he'd be happier running Pete's rather than sticking with Starbucks. So here's what happened. Pete's and Starbucks were separated. Jerry Baldwin stuck with Pete's and sold Starbucks to Howard Schultz. He combined it with the smaller company that he had started. I know there's a lot here, but the end result was Jerry Baldwin was now in charge of Pete's and Howard Schultz was now in charge of Starbucks. Now, I need to point out that compared to today, this is all very small stuff. Starbucks had 6 locations at the time of the deal and was sold for just under $4 million. I wouldn't say the initial founders did too much in the way of growing Starbucks. To use an obvious metaphor, they did plant the seed and also establish some principles that would be continued well past their involvement. But I think anyone would tell you that Howard Schultz is the reason Starbucks is so big. We all know how much he believed in the concept, and it was that confidence that motivated him to take some big risks in expanding it. He spared no expense in hiring top-tier managers, went into debt, even posted losses for a while, but the important thing is even through these uncertain times, he never compromised his vision. Here's what they had going for them. For one, quality. At times you can call this a disadvantage, but from the beginning, one of their principles was never to sacrifice quality. Good employees. Starbucks offered good pay and benefits, which resulted in a lower turnover and meant they were more knowledgeable and happier than their competitors. They would receive greater training when they were first hired and just be more experienced since they worked there longer. Their reputation. This sentence sounds ridiculous today, but Starbucks was sort of a cool, mysterious place that a lot of people had heard of, but few had actually been to. Their reputation preceded them, so whenever they would enter a new city, everyone would just hurry down to check them out. So in answering how did they get so big, I'd simply summarize that they had a good idea, a good reputation, good employees, good management, high standards, and most important, a leader who believed in what they were doing. From the time that he took over in 1987 to 1992, the chain had grown from 6 locations into over 100, which is incredible right there, but then they had their public offering and things started exploding. Again, what can you really say about this? I think it's just fun to look through how many locations they've opened over the years. This graph is crazy. You can't even see the lines until they started getting into the 1990s. That's when all those late night jokes started. And I should point out that when the second Austin Powers movie was poking fun at how big they were, that was in 1999, and we can see how much they've grown since. Then here's the same information but presented in a different way. The last graph showed how many total locations they had each year, and then this graph shows how many they added each year. It shows that they added more stores each year than the year before from 1987 to 2001, and have added new stores every single year with the one exception of 2009. You know, it's the economic recession and all that. Not great for a high-quality coffee provider, but obviously they brought it right back. Just a few other things worth mentioning that have contributed to their growth and brand awareness. In 1994, they entered into a joint venture with Pepsi to produce produce those frappuccinos. Then in 1998, they formed a licensing agreement with Kraft to make those bags of their coffee that you see in the grocery store. In 2003, they paid $72 million to buy the Seattle Coffee Company, which included the brand Seattle's Best. There's a lot more that could be said, but that's enough for today. Moving on to Howard Schultz. He has remained the CEO of Starbucks for the better part of the last 30 plus years, and the short times he wasn't, he was always involved in other big roles in the company. Today he's worth $4.6 billion, and Forbes ranks him as the 617th richest man in the world, which I know 617 isn't that high on the list, but it's still pretty rich. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of all this? It's a great story of following your passion and starting a business around it, but the biggest thing I take from it is you have to respect Howard Schultz. He saw a promising small business and not only squeezed his way into it, he eventually took it over and scaled it to an unheard of proportion. It doesn't even seem possible, but here we are. He made some smart moves, took some big risks, and it all paid off. So maybe we can pull some motivation from it. If you come across a small business with big potential, maybe try to get involved. I wouldn't expect these results, but we now know it's possible. It's just a great story of growing a business, easily one of the most notable, so any thoughts you have about it, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.